Podcasting from the base of Lake Tahoe in the eastern Sierras comes the Medicine Wheel. We are a group of progressive physicians seeking solutions and enlightenment while surfing the seas of big data and summiting mountains of research in an effort to make the practice of medicine more personal and medical knowledge more accessible, and empower you, the listener, to be as healthy as possible. Now, the Medicine Wheel.
Hello, I'm Dr. Robert Floyd with my partner, Dr. Sean Devlin, and we are at the Medicine Wheel. We have a very special guest today, Dr. Nathan Slotnick, MD, PhD. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Slotnick when I was doing my OBGYN rotations at Renown, and he helped us as residents deliver lots of babies and educate us in many different ways. Currently, Dr. Slotnick is the Medical Director of Medical Genetics and Genomics at Renown and St. Mary's Hospital. He's also the Director of Pediatric Genetics Clinic at Renown, and also a high-risk OB Oncology Clinic Director, as well as a Director of Genetics and Genomics Consortium in Reno, Nevada. We decided to have him on because the genetics and genomics is a fantastically burgeoning field here, and there's a lot to learn, and we're excited to be educated from Dr. Slotnick.
Well, thank you very much. This is a new experience for me, and I'm very happy to do this. It's great fun.
Excellent. Looking over your CV, you got a PhD. What did you get a PhD in?
My educational history is both prolonged and depressing at the same time. It took me a great deal of time to actually finish my education. My wife many times have asked me, why did it take so long? Because she had to work to support us. But I finished my undergraduate work without an idea of what I wanted to do. My original major at the University of Chicago was philosophy, but I soon realized that it's very difficult to make a living doing that. So I got a undergraduate degree in molecular biology at the University of Washington and decided that wasn't enough, so I did some graduate work. Graduate work led me to molecular genetics, and it's really been genetics that has really driven my career ever since. So the PhD was in New York many years ago, doing some very basic research on Drosophila DNA. At the conclusion of that training, for reasons that are too complicated to get into, it made sense for me to look at medicine. Medicine and genetics has a logical association, but at that time it was somewhat limited. So I looked at medical schools, and at that time, being an older student, it was unusual to get into a medical school. I was very old. I was all of 27 when I started medical school. But I was told that that's a way, you already have a career. That's way too old for you to think about this. So I did my PhD work, went into medicine. I was fortunate enough to get into the University of Pittsburgh, and medicine evolved into genetic medicine. Did my residency training in San Francisco at UCSF in obstetrics, did a fellowship in genetics, and it's been downhill ever since.
And how did you, when I met you, you were the high-risk OB doc at Renown, you and your partner.
Yeah.
And so how did you get into that field?
Well, you have to remember, if you turn back the clock, genetics as a medical discipline was very limited. Early medical geneticists really practiced as pediatric dysmorphologists. They went into the NICU. They saw babies that were unusual looking. They made diagnoses without really a lot of laboratory backup, and told the family what to expect in subsequent pregnancies, what recurrence risks were, what they can anticipate for this particular baby, and that's it. That's all we could do. Just as I was finishing medical school, the idea of being able to do prenatal diagnosis ultrasound diagnostic abilities with amniocentesis and CVS became much more available. So looking at obstetrics became an option. I hated my obstetrics training as a medical student for reasons that only a glass of beer could pry out of me. But I went to UCSF with the idea of doing obstetrics and then doing a genetics fellowship at UCSF. And that's what happened. I stayed in academic medicine at UC Davis, went back east to Virginia, where I was in academic medicine for years. And then about 15, 16 years ago, friends that I had made when I was in faculty at UC Davis called me in Virginia and asked, don't you want to come back out west, see your family more? And so I was lured out of academic medicine into private practice. High-risk obstetrics and genetics became a logical private practice goal for me.
Okay.
But it's changed a lot since then, too.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of change, it sounds like you were kind of at the forefront of medical genetics when it was...
Well... Yeah,
blossoming, maybe, I guess.
There wasn't a heck of a lot going on at that time, and if you look at the technology back in the 70s and the 80s, it was very, very limited. My PhD work, when I look back on it, I laugh at how naive and unstructured the whole process was. There was very little technologic advancement that was available. So nowadays, what we can do in diagnostics and therapeutics, manipulating DNA, doing things that are very sophisticated, and putting together management plans that are based on technologies that I couldn't even imagine 15 years ago, 20 years ago. We can get into some of that a little bit later, but that became obvious direction to head.
Okay.
It became a lot of fun.
Well, I when I went through my training program, I spent some time with some high-risk folks, and it was an awesome experience because you get to see things from a different point of view.
Yes.
Because these children that are in utero are kind of already at risk for a variety of reasons. One thing that was going on back then was doing amniotic sampling. And I just didn't know what the state of the field was now. Is that something that we're still doing? Or
it depends on what you're looking for. If you're talking about making diagnostic testing for things like chromosome number abnormalities, Down syndrome, trisomy 18, we've gone beyond that a lot. Amnio is still done for a number of diagnostic reasons, but much less so than before. We're now able to do a maternal blood sample and look for fetal DNA in maternal circulation and make the same kinds of statements about chromosome abnormalities, and even single gene studies can be done on a maternal blood sample.
Wow.
It won't be too long before we'll be able to do a whole genome sequence, well, make that an exome sequence, from a maternal blood sample of a fetus, just from a blood sample on the mother. So single gene studies, chromosome rearrangements, that kind of stuff is just around the corner. We're also doing some other things which kind of tie into what I'm doing right now, which is a lot of cancer genetics and cancer genetic studies. If we have a family in which a particular cancer gene mutation has been found, the obvious ones to think about are the ones that get the press, which are the BRCA genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2. And there's a family member with a BRCA mutation who wants to start a family. We can help that family member to avoid passing the mutation on to their children by doing PreImplantation genetic diagnoses before they even get pregnant. Take a sperm sample, take an egg, go to a 4-cell embryo, take a single cell. If that cell does not have the mutation that's in the family, that's the 4-cell embryo to use. So you can stop the passage of particular mutations in a family, and it's pretty routine. I'm now working with local reproductive endocrine specialists, and we're doing this routinely.
That is amazing.
Yeah. Well, we've come a long way. I know that for certain. I have a great interest in cancer genetics myself, and so
good.
it'll be something we'll have to chat about. Absolutely.
Yes, indeed.
So my take on this is because we do some BRCA 1 and 2 screening for our patients, and a lot of times they wonder, what does that mean? But you're telling me right now that if they're, say, 22, 23, they're going to want to have a child, that you would be able to have them go down this pathway.
If you know what to look for, if you have the specifics of what mutation that is of concern, you can easily do a pre-implantation genetic test on a 4 or 6 cell embryo.
So even if you had like a homozygous recessive disease, you could screen.
Well, there are many different options here, but if you're looking at something like a hereditary predispositional cancer risk, and there are many, many genes that we have access to, if you find somebody that wants to start a family who is a carrier for one of these particular mutations, they have the option of avoiding passing it on to the next generation. We're even, and I might bite my tongue about this, but we're even getting some support from the underwriters who will help, because they understand that it's much less expensive to go through this kind of PGD study than to pay for a child with a BRCA mutation during their lifetime.
Wow.
Underwriters don't think long-term like that often, but they're beginning to come around, I think.
So could this theoretically be the beginning of the end of hereditary disease?
Well,
I know that's a big statement, but
the answer is probably not. And if you think about all the different things that have to happen to produce a 30 trillion cell adult, all the things that have to happen properly, some forms of hereditary disease perhaps. But there are many somatic diseases, somatic mutation diseases that probably won't be able to be avoided.
What the number of percentage of breast cancer caused by hereditary disease is what, 10%?
Well, if you look at all cancers, about 10 to 15% are hereditary.
So the other 90 to 85 to 90% are somatic.
Well, they generally are, yeah. But there's another way to look at it, and I think it's almost more valuable, and that is because cancer, as an example, results from somatic changes in DNA, you have to think of cancer as a genetic disease. It's a DNA disease. Now, just because it's a genetic disease doesn't mean it's hereditary. Hereditary cancer is the 10 to 15% we were talking about before. But because all cancers are genetic, then we can think of genetic surveillance, and we can think of genetic management as part of cancer management, and it's becoming more and more that way. We're now choosing our therapies in cancer based on the genetics of the tumor. We're doing tumor genotyping, and that tumor genotyping allows us to select specifically the therapy that is designed for that particular tumor. And it works out routinely. And
you do a lot of that, right?
Yeah, we use Caris, Foundation One, Navican.
Yeah, I'm a consultant for, I should probably say this.
Disclosure, full disclosure.
Yeah, full disclosure. I'm a consultant for Foundation, and I have been hugely impressed with how powerful that technology really is.
Yeah.
It's a remarkable statement to be able to make, that you can look at 300 or 400 different genes in a tumor specimen and identify changes that will allow you to make specific choices in your therapy of those cancers. I like Foundation. I don't know that much about some of the other companies, but Foundation was pointed out to me years ago as being sort of the leader and the standard against many other somatic sequencing companies are doing. So that's a plug, I guess, for Foundation.
Sure. I just think the plug should be, this is an underutilized test.
It sort of depends. Yes, I think
as far as when you look at gross oncology practices,
yes,
that maybe 10 to 15% of them will get these things. But there's so many times that when I initially see somebody, we'll get that test back, and they're a candidate for non-NCCN guideline drugs. or immunotherapy, which
Sure.
they think, what the heck's going on there? So,
Well, you can't make a diagnosis unless you can think of it first, and you can't choose a therapy unless you're smart enough to be able to use all the tools that are in your bag
yeah.
to be able to make specific choices that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, cancer, it's a huge, well, for me, it's a wonderful redirection of my career. I got a little tired getting up in the middle of the night to catch babies, so being able to practice genetics, but to be able to do it in a different area like cancer or like adult genetics, like I have a pediatric genetics clinic that I see patients. I still do some obstetrics, but it's done in a different context.
That's a good segue. So some of the questions I have typed down, written down, because this can be very overwhelming for people. I mean, even very educated people, they hear these terms, DNA, RNA, genetics, genome, sequencing, and they don't know what's going on.
Sure.
What exactly does a geneticist do? I mean, I know that's another broad question, but...
Yeah, everybody can think back to their high school genetics course or their biology course that had genetics as part of it. The general approach and the way I talk to patients when I am sent a consultation or have a patient that I'm seeing is to remind them what genetics really is. And the best way to think of it is that we are what we are because of what we inherit from our parents. Our parents give us the instructions that tell the cells of our body precisely what to do. Those instructions tell brain cells to become brain cells, liver cells to become liver cells. The instructions are called genes. The genes are made of a chemical called DNA, and the DNA is packaged within the cell, within the nucleus, as chromosomes. There are 46 chromosomes in each of the cells of our body. 23 come from our father and 23 from our mother. If the father contributes 22 chromosomes plus an X, will be a girl. If the father contributes 22 plus a Y, will be a boy. The genes number anywhere from 30 to 50,000, and each of them has specific roles. Some of them have many different roles in the cell. When there is a mutation in a gene, it can affect that cell's function depending on what that cell is supposed to do. Many mutations in genes are never seen because they affect a component of cell function that is not that cell needs to do. So if you have a mutation in a hemoglobin gene, you're not going to see the phenotype in a skin cell. So it's important to remember that not all genetic variations are going to manifest with the phenotype or something that you'll see later. Now, the way geneticists practice is to think in terms of what those mutations, what those alterations, what those variations can do. We talked a little bit about cancer, but the majority of my career was spent doing obstetrics. And obstetric genetics is, in large part, prenatal diagnosis, fetal embryology, when it's normal and when it's not normal, and thinking in terms of what the phenotype would be in certain situations when there's a genetic abnormality. Hemoglobin is a good way to think about it. We know that certain ethnic groups have hemoglobinopathies that can predispose to hemoglobin diseases. Those diseases can be identified in a fetus, in an amniocentesis specimen, in a chorionic villus specimen, which is a biopsy of the placenta, or sometimes even before the pregnancy begins by sampling cells from a 6 or 8 cell embryo. And we kind of hinted at that already. So what a geneticist does is complex, and it depends on what context we're talking about. But an obstetric geneticist looks at genetics as expressed in a prenatal state, or maternal genetic disease, and the specifics there. A pediatric genetics practice focuses on children with genetic disease or a dysmorphic appearance, unusual appearance that might lead you to another specific diagnosis. Adult genetics can be complex. Cancer, hypercholesterolemia, cardiac disease. I just wrote a presentation for our cardiology colleagues about a condition that not a lot of people think about, but it's called thoracic aortic dissection and distension. You can inherit a mutation in a gene which will affect the structure of the aorta, and that will cause the aorta to expand and sometimes rupture. It's different from cholesterol-related aortic disease. This is something that you can see in younger people as well. About 5 years ago, I was contacted by a friend of mine who was an obstetrician. He said he has a woman who's pregnant, 34 years old. She's a nurse. She works at our hospital. She came in that morning for work, 12-hour shift. Turns out she worked on the cardiovascular floor and didn't feel right. So she sat there, and so they sent her down to the emergency room where they were working her up for gallbladder disease and GERD and all the different GI things, until somebody looked at the flat plate X-ray of her chest and said, "Why is her aorta like that?" And it turns out she was dissecting her aorta.
Wow.
And the obstetrician called me because he got a call saying, "What do we do with it?" So I said two things. I said, "You got to get that baby out now." And secondly, because of the blood redistribution, when the baby's delivered and the placenta's delivered, you got 40% of your cardiac output that can't go to the uterus anymore. Yeah. So you need to make sure the cardiovascular doctors replace the aorta immediately, because if they don't, it's going to be a disaster. Well, the cardiovascular doctors decided they wanted to watch. So 18 hours later, she's sitting on the cardiovascular floor. She's holding her brand new healthy baby with her mother, and says, "Mom, I don't feel right," and she dies.
Jesus.
She just keels over. Yeah, it was terrible. The story doesn't end there. It's even more pronounced, I guess. About 6 months later, her sister was at a music festival in Quincy and presents to the medic tent saying, "I'm having this GI kind of thing, like acid stomach, some pain." They said, "Oh, don't worry about it. Here's some antacids." And then she said, "My sister died 6 months ago, of a ruptured aneurysm. She had the same thing. She was 4 months in the hospital, and they finally fixed her. She's alive today." But it was one of those things that is a classic genetic disease, something called thoracic aortic dissection and distension syndrome, autosomal dominant, variable expression, 2 young women. Her mother had the same thing. I looked at the mother, and one of the little things you know about this, because you're that's how you're trained, you can look in the mother's eye, the grandmother of the baby, and see in the iris little cysts, which are a sign of a mutation in a particular gene that causes this dissection syndrome. So I could look at the grandmother, look in her eye, and there it is. You got the diagnosis right there.
Wow.
So that's what a geneticist does. It's familial inherited risk. That's kind of what we're talking about. So I just manipulate. That's a long story, I guess.
Well, no, it's a good story though, because that's
clinically
clinically relevant.
Okay.
Yeah, clinically relevant. What's curious to me is that with the changing field of genetics and the potential for genetic modification with a variety of tools, things like CRISPR-Cas9, that we are entering a new realm in which, we don't want to necessarily call them designer babies, but basically babies that may not have the same risks in their evolution, and we can sort of bypass a little bit of Darwinian, genetic evolution in that way. Do you have any concerns? Because everyone would bring up the term eugenics if we...
Yeah, I do, obviously. Okay. But I think there's another way we already hinted on a way around that. before you get pregnant, before pregnancy begins, you try your best to identify the risks for this particular couple, what those risks really are. Right now, we are routinely suggesting that every pregnant couple have carrier testing for autosomal recessive diseases that they can pass to their kids before they get pregnant. And if they do have something, you could go to your IVF center, avoid getting pregnant, and avoid the need to do CRISPR technology or gene editing in an individual. On the other hand, there are other things you can think of as well. There's a cancer gene called the APC gene. The APC gene is one of the polyposis syndrome genes associated with colorectal cancer. It's isolated in the colon. There's really no other peripheral manifestations of the mutation for that gene. But for most of the APC mutations, there is a 100% risk of colorectal cancer. And it's usually in younger individuals. So one way to approach therapy might be to look at taking advantage of the CRISPR-Cas technology to introduce APC gene repair in the colon as an enema. And we're working on a mouse model to do exactly that.
Say that again, please.
Okay. Okay, you know that if you can, let's say you construct a mouse. It has an APC gene mutation. You know that this APC gene mutation is going to provide a 100% risk of colorectal cancer for this mouse. We're talking mice here, we're not talking humans. You can take that mouse and see whether you can repair in the colon using CRISPR technology, CRISPR technology, using an enema. As an enema, you repair the mucosal alterations which provide the colorectal cancer risk.
Wow.
Just as an enema. You don't. That's the focus.
What's the vector? What's the vector carrying that?
Well, it's probably a viral.
Viral, okay.
I don't do a lot of this,
Right.
but we're looking at ways of
Right.
trying to provide focused therapies that won't have whole body risk
Right, systemic
exposure.
effects, right.
And that's where the enema idea came
That's
from.
interesting. This is reminding me. I was before we started the podcast. I was asking Doc if he listens to podcasts, and I just listened to a podcast on Joe Rogan about a guy. He wrote a book called Hacking Darwin. You might be very interested in reading this book.
I think I've heard of it. I just haven't read it.
I haven't read it either, but he's talking about, like, he's looking at the future, and this comes back to you looking at a 4 and 6 cell embryo, and he's saying the future is, he sees the future of people not having sex to have babies. They're going to be, babies are going to be made in the labs.
Yeah, I can see that as one direction that people may want to take.
I personally like having sex, so.
Well, you know, sex is amusing.
Yeah, but it's also there. You know, it's more than just that. It's the competition of which sperm gets to the egg, right, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's reasons that animals have sex to have babies, and to me, it seems so sterile and odd to say that. Well, I see in the human future that people aren't going to have sex to have babies anymore. I mean,
I think you're talking about Jamie Metzel's book, and that's concerning primarily.
that is he the one who wrote Hacking Darwin?
Hacking Darwin, yeah. So the concern was that you can actually reduce human suffering, reduce healthcare expenditures, and you're not trying to create a perfect human race, but you're trying to create a race that has less disease permeation.
Absolutely, he definitely says that for sure.
So, and there is benefit to that. Obviously, we don't want people suffering, and if you could prevent a trisomy or a cystic fibrosis, or somebody getting cancer young in life, then those things are, I think, have merit.
Yeah, he actually says that, and that it's almost foolish and selfish, and it could be illegal in the future if you pass on a disease like that.
There are many, many, many steps that need to be taken before we get to that point. We will probably get there. I mean, that's what humans do, is they design ways of improving in ways they think are better. Right. But just the idea of being able to provide a couple with as much information that they can have before they get pregnant about what their potential risks really are just makes a great deal of sense. Most of the patients that I've seen over the last 30 years did not plan their pregnancy. It just happened. And that's kind of a haphazard way to continue our species. If we know in advance what our risks really are, there may be a real advantage in taking a moment, maybe before sex or before reproduction, to assess what risks really are and try to mitigate those risks through information, education, and perhaps some targeted therapies.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Is the technology accessible to most to get that 4-6 cell?
I don't do IVF. I'm not a reproductive endocrine guy, but most good IVF centers are doing precisely this now. They may not be looking at single gene issues. They may be looking at, is this an aneuploidy situation? Are there 46 chromosomes and not 47? And that's a pretty simple thing to do. So you can, I know the practice here in town is probably a mile away from where we're sitting, is routinely doing genetic evaluation on embryos for many, many different things. Single gene issues, not as frequently, but it's part of what IVF and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis has become.
When I ask it, is it accessible? Is it covered by insurance? You said underwriters, but what would be the cost if someone?
Well, IVF is pretty expensive.
Yeah.
It is, but those expenses can be held down, and I think right now the idea of going to an underwriter and saying, your long-term expense for this particular situation will be much less if you help us, and it's much cheaper to do it at this end rather than at the other end. I can't promise that'll be the case, but it may be.
Yeah, like common sense sometimes. And
Yeah. I got involved with, before I moved here when I was in Virginia, this is something I didn't actually know before, but Tay-Sachs disease, which is a terrible, terrible disease, neurologic degeneration, and children die at age 2 or 3 from a terribly destructive disease, is a genetic disease. It is a genetic disease that, like hemoglobinopathies, occurs more frequently in certain ethnic groups, and for Tay-Sachs, it's the Jewish population that is most at risk. Well, I didn't know this before. I am Jewish, but turns out Tay-Sachs incidence and the gene mutation frequency is almost as high in the Cajun population of Louisiana. Okay,
Wow.
I didn't know this until it was explained to me that back in the 1600s, when Quebec was part of the French domain, there was a Jewish fur trapper who was a Tay-Sachs carrier, perfectly healthy himself, who I can just imagine him paddling up some river in Quebec, singing Alouette and impregnating everything he found
Right.
along the way.
Absolutely.
His mutation was seeded into the population in Quebec. What happened to Quebec? Well, when the French lost out years later, the Quebec became the Acadians, and the Acadians got shipped out and became the Cajuns, right? And the Cajun incidence and it's the same damn mutation that trapper had, 1600.
Yeah.
And so we did pre-implantation genetic diagnosis on a 4-cell embryo for Tay-Sachs disease in the Cajun population from Louisiana when I was back. It was the first Tay-Sachs pre-implantation genetic diagnostic test. It was actually pretty cool, but it was a tremendous learning experience to think that, well, first of all, that you could do it, but secondly, that your concept of what ethnic risks really are has to be rejiggered a little bit.
Yeah.
The last 3 Tay-Sachs babies born in the state of California were to non-Jewish couples. What that means then is that we're all big mixes, where there's no pure situation in anything. And when it comes to genetics, you can never really assume anything about anyone.
We're just all gumbo.
Well, it's just it's big mix. It really is, and that I think is to our benefit.
Yeah, for sure. What are your thoughts on this 23andMe? I know there's a variety of testers out there, but because the testing and we map the genome, and now the prices are coming down, and we have folks like 23andMe. But the problem is a lot of folks will get their results and go,
What does it mean?
Yeah, I'm from Northern Europe, but other than that, what's going to happen to me?
Well, I think the ancestry issues are interesting, but this whole concept of using these technologies for clinical benefit needs to be rethought. 23andMe and Ancestry and some of the others are entertainment. This is not medical quality stuff. As a matter of fact, it is hugely misrepresented. 23andMe, why does 23andMe exist? Why does the company exist?
To make money.
To make money, exactly. The value of doing these tests isn't in doing the tests. The value is in storing this sequencing information in these big data banks so that 23andMe can go to Pepsi and say, this collection of people with this particular sequence nucleotide polymorphism collection likes the taste of Pepsi. That's who you should market it to. It's for marketing. It's for making money. It's not genetic testing. You need to remember that. It's an important point. On top of that, it's misrepresented. 23andMe labels, and I don't know if this is kosher, I guess, to say this, but 23andMe markets what they're doing. Part of what they're doing is a BRCA test, that they say that we can test for breast cancer associated genes. Well, they're not doing that. What they're doing is looking at 3 SNPs, sequence nucleotide polymorphisms, that are found in Jewish populations only. That's it. And they tell the patient, or they don't direct the patient to think of their result as being anything other than limited, completely limited. Patients come out of that thinking, I've been tested. I don't have any hereditary risk for breast cancer. I don't have any risk for BRCA mutation, when that's not the case at all. And the reason is that's not the goal of the company. On top of that, there's another extra little spin on this. When I'm in my office, let's say I'm in my office and there's a rep from a DNA testing lab in the front, waiting in the waiting room. He brought lunch for the whole office, and he wants to meet with me. What does he want from me?
Business.
He wants me to order tests. He wants business. The problem is he understands the pros and cons of what it is that he's selling better than I do. So it's the summary line is, it's misrepresentation of a misunderstood technology to the misinformed.
Yeah. Well, that's scary.
Well, it happens all the time.
Absolutely, it happens for sure. And we get rid of testing and diagnostics when we see they serve no purpose. But what you're sharing now is really concerning, because the public in some way can be duped by thinking, this is I'm never going to have this cancer or that cancer or this heart disease.
The public is duped all the time. But almost more frightening than that is that doctors are duped all the time.
Yeah.
And there are 2 problems here. One, unless a doctor just came out of a genetics course 20 minutes ago, they're behind. This is an area that is changing so rapidly. Every 20 minutes there's something new. It's a full-time job for me just to stay on top of cancer genetics. I can't expect my colleague who took a genetics course 20 years ago in medical school to be able to critically analyze and make judgments about the value of any particular genetic test. On top of that, there's one other point. You can't tell a doctor he doesn't know what he thinks he knows.
Oh, yeah,
There's a huge amount of hubris involved in doctors. And if you try to tell a doctor, you took your genetics course 20 years ago, and maybe it's time to brush up if you're going to get involved in this, all they do is get mad at you.
Yeah.
They just get mad at somebody that tells them, maybe you don't understand this quite as well as you should.
Yeah. And they're cry because they heard Mendel died or something like that.
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah, but the problem is that, and the huge expense that is added on to healthcare from doctors who, in good faith, trying to do the best thing for their patient are making huge mistakes in what they're ordering.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Would you have, because I have patients that have resources that are willing to pay kind of whatever to get their true genomic profile done, and I know there's places like Dante, or do you have any recommendations where people could at least get the basic test done?
It sort of depends on what you want to look for.
Okay.
I think if there's I'm a very firm believer that there should be no impediment, there should be no speed bump in the way of a patient getting access to the information that is their own information, their own genetic information. So direct-to-consumer marketing and testing, to me, is wonderful. But it can't stop there, because most people, including doctors, don't understand what they get when they get a report. So any company that does direct-to-consumer marketing has to, in my mind, provide the backup to be able to have questions addressed and answered. And there are some companies that do a very good job at doing that. There's a company you can, I won't mention the name, out of the Bay Area that does a remarkably good job looking at 30 cancer genes we know to be associated with hereditary cancer risk. They have 40 genetic counselors in their employ so that any result that comes through can be explained by professionals who really know what they're talking about.
Are they explaining to the general public, or is this
well,
the
let's say the
doctors
test
that call
gets
in?
done, then the patient with the result calls in and says, I need some help in understanding what this is all about. So I really do believe that this is the kind of thing that everybody should have access to, but only if there's the ability to have post-test and sometimes even pre-test counseling available. It's important, and it's not expensive. This 30 gene panel of genes is under $100.
Wow, that's cheap.
Yeah, I mean, compared, I look at all my oncology colleagues, all of the chemo and the radiation and the surgical oncology therapies, and what genetics is just a tiny little snippet of money spent. It's just yeah. So, and we're getting to the point right now where every breast cancer patient should have germline testing. Every pancreatic cancer patient should have germline testing. Most colorectal cancers should have germline testing. And we're approaching every prostate cancer patient because the incidence of hereditary risk is so high in these populations. And because therapies are based on what you can find, there's some real benefit in spinning that off.
Yeah.
So, what kind of social, legal, ethical, and moral implications could this field bring? I mean, I know there's a lot.
There are,
but I mean, like the social implications. I mean,
I guess it sort of depends. I can't. That's almost too nebulous a question for me to even address. One thing's for sure, though, and that is that human nature being what it is, curiosity, energy, financial motivation, whatever way you want to think about it, these approaches and these diagnostic advances are not going to go away. They'll continue and they'll continue. The goal will be to try to at least anticipate when things are maybe going a little bit over the edge, to pull back a little. And any advance needs to be considered within the multiple different contexts. That's where this researcher in China really needed to be reined in a bit before that disaster happened.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's good. I mean, you brought that up, and I know Dr. Floyd and I talked about that. But yeah, it's like, when you start to apply this to babies that are actually going to be born in a way that is unregulated or unsupervised, that's
there's
scary.
a new technology just came out this week about babies, and this is in animal studies, have shorter lives if they receive the CRISPR studies. So, I mean, you can't just look at repairing a particular gene and that's it. It has to be within the whole context of the 30 trillion cells that makes up an adult.
Total butterfly effect.
Yeah, it's like
Exactly.
I just read that guy in China is
Yeah.
in big trouble.
We'll see. Yeah, we'll see.
Big Trouble in Little China. Or Big China.
Big trouble in Little China.
Yeah.
But I would be surprised if he's alive in a year. I mean, if the Chinese government is really angry with him, because this said he went beyond the bounds of, like, he turned in fake blood tests with. It was pretty interesting to read.
Yeah, that's another thing. Much of what you read in scientific journals is fake anyway.
Garbage, fake news.
Well, let's put it like this. Fake is not the right word. The motivations and the oversight for even basic research is just not what it should be. So there are issues having to do with what's real and what is not, and grants, and there has to be a better way to do basic science and clinical science research that doesn't depend on and isn't responsible to all the pressure that researchers feel.
I mean, look at Duke, for instance, recently, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere.
Everywhere.
The reason I'm in medicine now is because of this. And again, we can do this over a glass of wine, I guess. but it's I don't think there's anyone who spent any time in research who hasn't had the experience of knowing about or personally affected by somebody lying.
Yeah.
Lying.
Well, it's sad because the amount of pressure it's put on folks to sort of perform and publish and to generate something new and novel is there, and it's real, and it's it's their livelihood.
Publish and perish, right?
Right, and there has to be a better way to do it. There really does have to be a better. I think the whole concept of profit and financial benefit, all of that needs to be reconsidered.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot.
So, back to my moral, legal, ethical.
Sure.
I mean, pick one. Is there? Do you see some moral challenges with this? Are people gonna, be making babies that they want with blue eyes or whatever? I mean, and changing things, because it's such a broad field. I don't think. Does anyone know where it's going?
You're getting this is sort of spinning away from my comfort base, I guess. People. This is way more philosophy than I'm prepared.
What's your philosophy major, though, right?
Okay. Individual human beings are wonderful, generous, considerate, intelligent, helpful in their lives. Groups of people are exactly the opposite. When you talk about groups of people, their actions are not considered. They respond. Well, I mean, just look at politics nowadays. The groups of people are in it for group profit, for group benefit. Damn the differences. So decisions, therefore, are based on a couple of things: greed and dogma. Okay, dogma being irrational, non-rational doesn't make sense, but irrational approaches to answers of certain questions, and greed. The irrational approaches manifest themselves, and I'm going to get myself in trouble for saying this, as religion. Religion is the greatest boondoggle ever, and it prevents our species from advancing. I believe that wholeheartedly. It's all religion, because all religion encourages dogmatic approach to answering difficult questions. And when you couple this with greed, you end up getting a bad outcome. Greed and dogma are the reasons that if our species fails, it's going to be for those reasons. So right now, you end up having clinical activity modified by those two components. And that means that research and into what we can do clinically is being done for all the wrong reasons. So until we can get rid of money, and until we can get rid of religion, we're going to be having these battles over and over and over again, and probably not moving very far or very fast. Ultimately, designing babies to be healthy, to avoid disease, to be something that is kind of available is more of a red herring, I think, than being able to have people understand what it is they're getting into when they decide to reproduce. By understanding in advance what the implications of reproduction really are, I think we'll be able to avoid a lot of heartaches that are currently part of what we do as physicians. Boy, that was way out of
That's
left
I
field.
just asked this question because I was reading, Kim she got her master's at GW, and we get these, medical school mini magazines, and one of the last ones was actually on genomics, and they actually have a conference, the moral, legal, ethical implications of genomics, and I was just reading it, and to me, it kind of sparked some questioning of like, wow, unless you really sit down and think about what really could come and what should come and what should not come, there's so much.
I think it's all the things we can imagine. Well, one of my mentors, and this is many years ago, one of my mentors said, if you can imagine it, it'll happen. And right now, I think that's everything we've seen. I mean, I couldn't have even imagined what the kind of practice I'm having right now 20 years ago. So the idea of designer babies, that's just a terribly pejorative term, but that kind of technology we've already got it. In some ways, we've already got it. So it's going to happen. Are we prepared for it? Probably not. And the reason we're not prepared is for the dogma and greed issues that we sort of touched on before. It's not because the science is bad, although there may be bad science, or bad decisions made on bad science. And it's not because of bad medicine, although it could be bad medicine based on bad science. But the bottom line is that the problems we get into are not medical or scientific, usually. They're more often all this other crap that surrounds us daily. So,
well, on this topic, I know that there's a question of, what's the ethics behind one thing or another, or if it's appropriate or not, or should it be, supervised or regulated. But currently, today, for applicable information, to say a young couple, mid-20s, they've started their careers, they're planning a pregnancy, what should be in the back of their mind about preparation for that pregnancy?
Well, I guess the first thing to do is to visit a reproductive specialist, and usually that means an obstetrician, to be able to identify heritable risks before the pregnancy begins. That's number one. And that's routinely done. There are companies that will look at 250 different genes, and that's easy to do. Secondly, to identify potential risks in the mother that might reflect on how the pregnancy would go. We know that, for example, women who have a condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a relatively common connective tissue disorder, have cervixes which are inherently weak. If you know that in advance, you can watch the cervical strength and, if necessary, put a stitch in the cervix at 12 or 13 weeks that would allow the pregnancy to succeed. If the woman is over the age of 35, this is routine. We've been doing this for years, offering prenatal diagnostic testing, non-invasive prenatal screening tests, ultrasounds, all the different things that we can anticipate. If there's a family history of a specific issue, know it in advance and start your pregnancy with the best possible information. If you're thinking about getting pregnant, you start supplementing your diet with a little bit of folic acid. We know that has tremendous benefits in the way of neural tube defects, spina bifida, anencephaly, and other clefting problems like facial clefts can be minimized by using folic acid supplementation. And then early prenatal care can make a difference as well. Avoid drugs in pregnancy. I have access to a teratogen registry that allows me, if there's any medication exposure or even non-medication exposure in a pregnancy, I'll be able to look it up and find out what's going on. I had a patient 2 years ago. She came to me and said, I have a curious question for you. I make leaded windows. Okay. What about the lead vapor when I make is that dangerous to my baby? I said, well, gosh, I've never had that question before. And I looked it up, and this website had it. The database had this information. So, yeah, those kinds of questions are relatively easily researched, and it's important to figure out. Know your caregiver, start your pregnancy healthy and informed, and your outcomes are almost always going to be good.
Well, that's really critical wisdom, and unfortunately, I don't know what percentage of people actually do this, because the majority of patients that I'll see were like, oh, we're pregnant.
That sort of goes back to what I said before. Most patients that I've seen over 30 years of doing obstetric genetics didn't plan their pregnancy. It just kind of happened. Right. And by the time you realize you're pregnant, most of the information that could be of use to you is, the horse is already out of the barn.
Yeah.
It's too late.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's switch to some personal stuff. Not too personal, but like we had some questions that we asked a lot of our guests. And
sure.
What are some of the most profound lessons you've learned in medicine?
It's hard. Profound lessons, I guess. I think the things that I most value in my training and exposure is they're related to being exposed to really smart people. I think we all as humans get benefits from human interactions that stimulate our brains to think rather than do the opposite. And for me, in terms of profound influences, I guess I'd have to say the exposures that I've gotten to my mentors has been remarkable. I also have a great deal of value, and I look back at my career as getting a great deal of pleasure from taking care of patients through their pregnancies or through their cancer diagnoses. The most valuable of those are the pregnancies that have involved a pregnancy loss for one reason or another, and then have the same couple come back 2 years later with a pregnancy with a healthy outcome. That continuity and that reinforcement was very valuable to me too.
Great. So one of the other things we're always curious about is outside of the field of medicine. What are some of your passions and drivers?
I have a few hobbies. My most unusual hobby, I guess, is that I restore and recondition vintage motorcycles. So I have for years kind of bought they have to be very simple for me to do that. But I've restored a number of old British motorcycles and have enjoyed doing that. The nice thing is that they're so easy to work on. So easy to do.
It's like working on a VW. It's just anybody
everything's
can do it.
Everything's right there, and the technology is 1930s technology, so it's simple to do. And when you put something together like that and kick it over and it runs, it's a wonderfully reinforcing kind of thing. It's very nice. So those kinds of hobbies. I enjoy gardening. My wife and I just planted a couple planter boxes this last weekend, and that's a lot of fun too. I have a dog that takes me for walks.
Good,
which is good.
Do you have a bunch of the vintage motorcycles?
Not anymore. My wife and I downsized, so I'm now looking to. I sold on my bikes, and I'm kind of looking to get back into it, but I have to get her permission first, and that's always hard.
So I saw on your resume that you were in Bishop for a little while.
Well, I am still.
Okay.
When I decided to cut back my obstetric practice, I have 3 friends who are obstetricians down in Bishop. They had been sending me patients for years and years and years, and I got involved in caring for one of them when she was pregnant. So when I announced that I won't be doing a lot of perinatal stuff in Reno, they said, well, you want to come down here? So starting in January of 2018, once a month, I drive down to Bishop. I see patients, I do ultrasounds, I do genetic consultation. Now I'm doing cancer genetics and giving talks. And it's turned into a course in genetics, basically. And now they want me to come twice a month. So for the last few months, I've been going down every other Friday. And tomorrow afternoon, I'll be driving to Bishop.
Awesome. Such a beautiful area. I worked down there for a couple years.
Yeah, it is lovely. It really is. And the drive down there is worth it, except when it's snowing.
Yeah.
Then it's not easy. But it is lovely, and the people are just great. And I discovered the greatest bakery on the eastern side.
Yes, I stopped by there on my way back from Los Angeles.
It is great. So
I think they own half the town. I'm pretty sure.
What's that?
They're all over the place down there.
Yeah, but I think the bakery you're thinking of is not the one I'm thinking of.
Oh, really? You're thinking of another one?
Yeah, the one that has a German name is not it.
It is not.
I might as well give a plug. Great Basin Bakery.
Great Basin Bakery
is
wonderful.
Much better.
We'll have to check it out.
Much better.
Yeah,
it is great. And now I have some friends in Quincy who want me to do the same thing. So I may be doing a lot of road
really
trips.
Tough to end up in those places.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, I was looking
nice.
at your CV, and it looks like you did do a lot of talks in Quincy already, right?
Yeah, I had been going up there for the last 5 or 6 years to a couple times a year, just give a little talk on obstetrics or genetics or cancer or whatever. And now they want me to come once a month to see patients.
Well, that's awesome for them. Those communities are so deserving, and to have an expert like you to come in.
Well, there are 2 benefits here. One, I just enjoy going, and secondly, I do like seeing Reno in my rearview mirror. I like it here, but I like leaving here too.
Yeah.
It's nice.
Yeah, but like he says, the communities are benefiting. Like what you said before, being surrounded by people that are smarter than you, and education is great, and it's something that a lot of people don't get, especially in the small communities. They're not exposed to people of knowledge.
Yeah, I hope this will work, but tomorrow at noon I'm supposed to be meeting with telehealth people and trying to figure out a way to practice genetics throughout. There's so many. Nevada's so huge. Mm-hmm. And there are so many places that really do need the kinds of medical access that they just don't have otherwise.
Absolutely.
One of the nice things about genetics is I don't actually have to physically be there to do a cancer risk assessment and do cancer testing. I don't physically have to be there to do some pediatric stuff as well. So trying to figure out a way to do a telehealth project throughout some of the Winnemucca and Ely and Elko and
the rural
stuff
communities.
like that. Yeah, some rural stuff, which would be fun too.
That's neat.
Absolutely. Well, I know we're getting on in the hour, and I wanted to know if you had any pearls of wisdom you can leave some of our listeners in and around genetics.
I think we pretty much touched on everything, but yes, let me say one. Genetics has always been considered a part of different disciplines. Like internal medicine doctors know that genetics can play a role in what they do. Pediatricians, obstetricians. Starting around 30 years ago, it's about 30 years now, genetics became an entity on its own, and there is now a board of medical genetics. And there are residencies in medical genetics that you can go to. Instead of having to do pediatrics or obstetrics first, like I did, you can actually go into genetics as a discipline. So I don't know if this is a pearl, but I would love to be able to encourage young people who are interested in a brilliant career and a wonderful experience to go into genetics as a medical discipline. And one of my goals has been to try to encourage medical students here in Reno to look at genetics as a primary discipline for their training. But anyone who has an interest in getting into medicine and wants to do something fascinating that will be really cutting edge for the next 40 or 50 years, this would be a great direction to take.
Yeah, that's awesome.
How long is that residency?
It's a 4-year residency.
4-year residency.
And you get trained in not just, say, clinical dysmorphology, but you also get laboratory training. You can do research. You got some really basic stuff. And because there are so few medical geneticists around, if you come out of a program like that, wherever you go, you will be the expert. And
Right.
there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah.
There really is. There's some real value there.
Oh, that's amazing.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Anything else?
No, I think that's wonderful. I'd definitely love to have you back because you were a fount of knowledge.
Well, I do. No. One of the nice things about doing what I've done for as long as I've done it is that you accumulate a whole collection of interesting stories. So I have a collection of stories that we can sort of plumb into, I guess. We can go into specific areas, I guess.
Yeah, I think that'd be nice. Maybe even do one on just cancer genomics.
Cancer would be a good one to do.
Yeah, I think that's...
one approach might be, we think of genetics as Mendelian genetics, dominant, recessive, X-linked, yada, yada, yada. There are whole other areas of genetics that are non-Mendelian, and to talk about some of those non-Mendelian issues, I think can be quite instructive as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you had the opportunity to read the book The Gene by Siddhartha Mukherjee. He wrote
I did.
Cancer of Temporal Maladies.
Yes.
So but phenomenal read and very much discussing some of the things you just brought up.
Yeah, I think it would be fun to do that. There's a huge amount of complexity, but it's all fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess in retrospect, I look at my career as being moving from one fascinating area to another. It's been great. My biggest regret, I guess, is that I'm not 30 years younger to go to be around.
Do it again.
to do it again, or to look forward to what the next 30 years will be.
Yeah,
it'd be great. I'll probably be retiring in the next few years, although don't tell my wife, she doesn't want me around the house.
Sure.
So, but I would love to be able to get in a time capsule and go forward 40 years and see where we will be in a lot of different areas, but in this area in particular, genetics, I'd love to be able to know where we'll be.
Well, thank you very much,
You're
Dr.
welcome.
Slotnick. How can the viewers, listeners reach you?
Well,
if you want to be reached.
Yeah, I guess at this point right now, my primary office is in Reno at the Cancer Institute at Renown Health Center. I'm pretty much available through there, although I do kind of get around a little bit, and I'm happy to interact with anyone who wants to shoot the breeze. And if anybody wants to come by, I'll buy them a cup of coffee.
Good.
There's a Starbucks downstairs, and we can schmooze. But that would be
great.
That would be fine.
Okay. Wonderful.
Excellent.
Yeah, we'll make sure your information's posted on the video.
Perfect. That'd be fine.
And this is Dr. Floyd and Dr. Devlin with Dr. Slotnick, and we are signing off from the Medicine Wheel this week. Please make sure and comment and like or give us any feedback on the apps that you're using, and we appreciate it. And to your health. Thank you.
The Medicine Wheel encourages all of our listeners to subscribe to our newsletter and podcasts as we continue to explore the world of medicine, bringing you up-to-date health and science information. The Medicine Wheel invites our listeners to email us any newsworthy stories or topics they wish to explore further and discuss on the podcast. For more information about the Medicine Wheel, please visit us at our website, www.themedicinewheel.org, and on Facebook, and finally on Twitter and Instagram at The MedWheel.
In an effort to support access to integrative medicine and functional medicine options for those in need and education for those who need information, please consider donating to Project OmCare, 501c3.org. Please go to our website, www.themedicinewheel.org, to learn more.
Thank you again to all our local sponsors, Grateful Gardens, Lighthouse Coffee, and Dorinda's Chocolates, which represent some of the best organic and appetizing options in the Reno, Tahoe area.
Lighthouse Coffee Shop is a proud sponsor of the Medicine Wheel. We are a family-owned and operated local coffee shop. Our goal as a business and a family is to cultivate community wherever we are. All of our coffee is ethically sourced, organic, and farm fresh. It's roasted in-house daily, guaranteeing you access to the freshest cup of coffee on the planet. We care deeply for our community and everyone in it. We strive to provide you with the best ingredients and most comfortable environment. Come and enjoy coffee with us. We are family, and we would love for you to be part of it.
Gerber Medical Clinic is proud to support the Medicine Wheel and medical education to improve health quality, nurturing the lifestyles of our listening community, enhancing wellness for all. Thanks again to Wired Insights and their talented team for making our podcasting dream possible.
In closing, we would like to remind all of our listeners, if you have a medical concern or diagnosis, you need to see your personal doctor without delay, and if needed, obtain a referral to a specialist. If ever you feel the health issue you have is urgent or an emergency, please call 911 and go to your nearest emergency room. Please do not take any of our physicians' commentary or our guests' opinion as medical advice, and always seek out medical care from fully licensed and appropriately trained medical professionals in your area. The information shared in this podcast is for general information only and should not be construed as medical advice, and understand that no doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information and educational materials linked to this podcast and website are employed at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not meant to be used as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
This is the Medicine Wheel signing off for this week with a reminder to live, love, listen, and learn.